Nishant and Bishakha. Really happy that you could make it today to this event. I wanted to start off with a few framing questions that sort of highlight the inquiries that have emerged throughout this project. And I think maybe the very first one I'll ask both of you is, are there particularly distinctive characteristics or attributes when you think about platforms and ecosystems in the Asia-Pacific region? Any particular features that they share? Are they addressing different cultural or socioeconomic problems? Do they arise out of different contexts? So anything that you think make platforms different and unique in this part of the world? Nishant, can I turn to you first?
Yeah, that's always the fascinating question, right? Saying, because on the one hand, when you talk about platforms, there is this idea that platforms are universal, that they look the same. Largely because we have also in the cultural zeitgeist bought into the idea that platforms are owned by big tech companies, which more or less have started ruling the world. But I think the minute you kind of start drilling down at a regional level, you realize that platforms, while they might have a global brand, are actually uniquely local. That platforms are a part of complex systems of localization, which range from input scripts to different kinds of aesthetics, to the ways in which people produce memes, or the fact that there are countries which have different kinds of literacies. So one of my favorite example always is that a lot of people in my life who might be considered, let's say, more senior users of platforms like WhatsApp never ever type on it, right? Their entire WhatsApp conversations are conducted entirely through a barrage of mass-produced visuals, which keep on wishing people different things in the morning, afternoon, evening, and on different festivals. But they also just have an enormous exchange of video messages that they just send to and fro, simply because a lot of them do not have English as their first language. They are not very fluent in typing in English or even transcribing their local languages in English. So they've just figured out saying, I don't need to type. I can just use WhatsApp as a video messaging service. And I often kind of joke saying that for that generation, WhatsApp was in fact the first TikTok. Like they invented TikTok on WhatsApp before TikTok became a thing with the younger generations.
I was going to ask you exactly that. It was immediately bringing up ideas of TikTok when I heard you describing that.
Yeah, so I think we need to start looking at the fact that while platforms might have common affordances, eventually there are three factors which affect them. One is localization, the second is the aesthetics, and the third is the demography. And a confluence of this and a mix and match of this is always going to produce the platform as something new each time we kind of dig an inquiry into it. And I think the inquiries that we have started with this particular project on platform futures is precisely doing that. It's trying to tell us and show us how a platform ecosystem is perhaps more important in understanding the platform rather than the platform itself, right? So not the content which is produced on it, but the context within which the platform kind of exists. Mari, you are on mute.
Yes. Every event has to have one person saying you're on mute. So we've got ours out of the way very quickly. I was actually saying, Nishant, that I think that's a really critical point because we tend to think of platforms as sort of functioning in a vacuum, as if they are sort of fully constituted from the get-go. And I think we often forget, well, academics don't, I suppose, but I think users often forget that they are shaping and constituting the platform, and the platform is in turn constituting and shaping them. And it is a reflexive constitutory relationship, and the platform does not exist independent of all of these different stakeholders, right? It could be users, it could be governance members, policymakers, laws and regulations, cultural contexts. So many things actually shape, as you said, that each time it's being made anew. So no two people are looking at a platform in exactly the same way and experiencing the same thing. And I think That's a really good point at which to bring in Bishakha as well, because Bishakha, you've done really important work looking at how gender and sexuality play a really important role in this experience, right? This virtual participation, the way that that people interact online. And I think in a very positive way, right? The opportunities and spaces that it might enable, but equally very fundamental barriers and obstacles to everyone participating equally, whatever equally really means, right? So I wonder, given the work that you do with Point of View, if you could share perhaps some of your thoughts on trends or attributes in the region that sort of make Asian platforms or Asian interactions with platforms something quite unique and different.
Thanks, Malavika. That's a great question. And I'm going to follow up actually where Nishant left off by saying that, yes, the platform is ultimately a product of the interaction, like people are the platform in a sense, right? And it's an interaction between people and systems and machines, etc., and infrastructure. I think what's interesting among many of the groups that we work with at Point of View is they are not English speaking. English is not their first language, so it's often an Indian language. And when we think about the aesthetics of platforms, often they are designed for a particular user. And that user is not necessarily rural or tribal or non-native English speaking, right? And I think what we see quite often is that women or girls or queer persons from low-income communities who are very much part of these platforms, right? Particularly when we think, say, WhatsApp, which is the most widely used platform in India. Because of the aesthetics and because of a certain sort of hierarchy, there's a sense of not belonging to the platform. There's a sense of almost being an interloper and a sense somehow that this platform was not designed for me. And that comes through also in terms of, again, if everything is not localized, right? If it's only partially localized, the instructions, etc., etc. So one of the things we find is that given the kind of diversity of users in the Indian context, a platform that is mainly designed for what I would call text-first communities with high literacy, etc., really doesn't work because most of them use voice. When we work with, say, domestic workers on WhatsApp, they're leaving voice messages, right? So they're kind of working around sort of the dominant part of the platform and finding a workaround and making it their own. So I think the biggest thing that strikes me is how do we design platforms if we really think of them as, microcosms of our worlds or of new worlds in the making digitally, not for one set of people, but really in some sort of hybrid way, which allows people to enter and occupy these spaces as like digital citizens almost, right? Instead of feeling like, oh my God, I don't know, this, that, etc., and feeling their way nervously and in an intimidated and alienated way around them.
Thanks, Bishakha. I think that's super, super important. And I think one thing I would like to ask is, when it comes to the ways that they participate, right? You both of you mentioned ways in which it can exclude them and the sort of barriers they might face, whether it comes to literacy or particular affordances of the platforms. Are there things that these digital platforms enable that might be lost to them in the physical meet space offline world, right? Are there things that they can do online through their digital selves and virtual selves that they otherwise might not have access to? Sort of the more positive end of things.
So maybe, I can share the example actually that a lot of women, girls, certainly queer persons, etc., use digital platforms to explore gender and sexuality, right? So even the simple act of taking a certain photograph of yourself, wearing something that you may not be allowed to wear in your physical community, but putting up that image, right? That gives you space. There's an interesting example in one of our workshops. A woman came from rural Madhya Pradesh in central India. She had just bought a new smartphone and she took a selfie of herself with it, with her sari, but she had taken the sari pallu off her head. And when she went back home and showed her husband the photograph, he was enraged with the selfie and he took her phone, and she had just bought it, and flung it across the room and smashed it. To me, that tells me the story of what you're not allowed to do in physical spaces. Even that simple pleasure of just like showing, exploring, maybe meeting romantic possibilities, hooking up, right? Being able to assert yourself in all these ways. Being able to maybe even like go to certain sites for entertainment, which you can't necessarily do in all physical spaces if you're a girl or a woman, etc. Right? Yeah. Just these kinds of small things, just making it your personal space to do exactly what you want. I think that's the real gift of platforms in a sense.
When you say the word selfie, I can see Nishant immediately perk up, because I know, Nishant, you've done so much when it comes to thinking about selfies and about sort of about squares and rectangles and how we, present and represent ourselves. I wonder if you want to speak to that, but also I think you've done so much work on access to knowledge in the past, and I wonder if, apart from the expressive features that Bishakha mentioned and those sort of possibilities, I wonder if you could also speak about opportunities and access to resources and information that otherwise people might find really hard to come in contact with.
Yeah, I mean, of course, selfies are a single point of obsession for me and has been for a long time. But I think I particularly want to draw upon Bishakha's example. And in fact, Bishakha's done way more work on access to knowledge than I have. So maybe we should bring her into that conversation. But I think this notion of expression is also interesting, because one of the things that the platform comes with is a promise of giving you access to information about the other. But the most important thing that platforms do is gives you access to information about yourself, right? Especially for younger users of platforms, as Bishakha points out, it is a very new space for exploring identities, sexualities, expressions, and so on. In the early days of the internet, Nitya Vasudevan and Nitin Manayat in India did this wonderful history of the queer internet in India. And they made a very convincing argument saying that there was no way of being queer in India without being online. There could be many kinds of sexualities which were present in practice, but to be queer was a platform aesthetic. They particularly look at how the arrival of a web platform like Planet Romeo, which also became the inquiry of so many, so-called sting operations and so on, was actually the first manifestation of what it meant to be queer online. And Namita Avriti Malhotra, in another history, kind of talks about pornography in a similar way, right? If there is one platform that connects India together, or in fact connects the whole world together, it's Pornhub. I mean, more than Google, it is the dominant aesthetic of how we imagine and see ourselves in intimate and sexual relationships with different kinds of bodies and in promiscuous conditions. So it might be good to realize that the affordance of the platform. So Wendy Chan has this wonderful expression where she says, to become digital is to become translated. Platforms translate you. And in the process of being translated, even though it's through algorithmic interventions, even though it's through capturing specific kinds of data points, even though sometimes there are dire questions of privacy and consent and ownership that come into play, in the process of translation, you transform yourself into becoming new kinds of entities. And so I'm always fascinated by not just having the access to this, information superhighway, because let's face it, I mean, yes, we could all read Karl Marx right now because it's freely available on the Gutenberg project. But I mean, largely we just want to watch pictures of cute cats, and that's fine. Because it's not about the content that you are consuming, but who you become when you consume that content. Right? The sense of empowerment, the sense of feeling validated, the sense of experimentation, the sense of role playing. So it's an interesting negotiation. I'm not particularly sure if it's an easy affordance, but the fact that you can negotiate with scripts of the past and kind of reformulate them. So in some of my work, for example, I've said that one of the most fascinating things that algorithmic platform-based profiles have done is that they have opened up our pasts for prediction. The capacity to predict what pasts we have, be it something as deeply, let's say, biological as 23andMe, where your DNA check suddenly says, oh, you are 1/16th European. And then you're like, which of my grandparents did what, right? Because you can't find that in your family tree. Or the fact that you can have these different kinds of profiles and personas and avatars, which are your negotiation in how you want to see and translate yourself. I think that's going to be the most interesting thing for a large population which is still learning to come online. This might look like very basic for a lot of people who already have the privilege of having the platforms, as Bishakha says, designed for them. But for those of the people who are learning to figure out how to do it, I think the negotiation is perhaps the most interesting one. And that's also the
Yeah, Nishant, I'm going to bring Bishakha in a second. I just wanted to also underline, when you mentioned Wendy Chan's point of being translated, is that a passive thing where the translation happens external to you and you have little agency or autonomy over it? Or is it something that the person also participates in and helps to shape? They are translating actively as opposed to being translated by a platform against their wishes, kicking and screaming? Or is it a bit of both?
I think Wendy's use of the translation metaphor is very beautiful because she's not talking about being written,
right.
Which is, but she's really talking about being translated. And if we look at Liu Rongpong, who is this queer feminist Taiwanese scholar, Liu Rongpong talks about how translation is wonderful because in the translation, we escape the binary of speech and silence. Because in translation is the politics and poetics of reticence. Because translation allows you for the negotiation where you say, I know this, but I exercise my right not to say it. And then while we talk about, how there is extraction of data and information and so on, there is also personal manipulation and obfuscation practices which people put into play. From young teenagers having their Finstas so that they can hide from their parents and grandparents who are now on Facebook and Instagram, to different people who will create headless profiles or, on queer dating sites have specific kinds of images where you show enough of your body but not enough to be identified. Like there are these many multiple ways by which filtering and so on is in the hands of the consumer right now or the user. And that these are negotiation practices. You learn how to do it. And so every time people talk about digital literacy, I think this is what we need to bring into play. If you want people to be platform literate, you don't have to teach them how to get on there. You have to teach them how to negotiate with them, right? And that's the translation process.
Yeah. Bishakha, you've been waiting very patiently to jump in.
Well, everything that Nishant said resonated so much that I started thinking of a few new things, actually. I think just adding on, one is we did a study which found that in the last 10 years, practically all the queer groups that have formed in India in smaller cities or towns have formed online first, simply because physical spaces were not conducive, right? So just to sort of buttress the point that Nishant made. I also thought of an interesting metaphor that we use that when we talk about platforms with low-income communities, tribal groups, etc. There's a saying in India called Jal Jangal Zameen, which is water, forest, land, right? Which are the critical resources that communities, particularly communities that live off the land, need to survive. And increasingly we say, well, it's Jal Jangal Zameen and mobile phone. And they're very intrigued initially and say, well, how can you add the mobile phone to this? But really, when we think about it, particularly when we think about last year, and how much people relied on platforms for practically everything, right? From food security to medical information to literally help with somebody who's fallen ill, right? Like social media platforms almost turned into sort of like disaster hotlines. So I think in that sense, we are trying to really reorient the notion of platforms, not as sort of, add-ons, but as sort of integral, and the notion of the mobile ecosystem also as a very vital resource.
And that is also extremely sort of visceral, right? It's a very visual sort of idea of what people anticipate and what their needs and desires are when it comes to technology. But I think coming back to Nishant's, point about negotiating, I know one of the tropes that, whether we like it or not, these balancing metaphors keep coming up. So this trope of this balancing act between collecting data and getting benefits and societal good on the one hand, versus safeguarding privacy, anonymity, choice, agency on the other hand. I mean, some would say that's set up as a false binary, like why can't you have both? And of course, there are ways that, privacy preserving tools are trying to do that and optimize for both. But I wonder, in this sort of, you've both talked about balancing and negotiating and contestations. Where do you see these frictions and challenges going as platforms develop and evolve, as more people use them? As you said, Bishakha, not just for entertainment, but for survival, for filling governance gaps, filling lacunae where the government isn't providing particular essential services that citizens need, and they have to create bottoms-up resources where they help each other and it's distributed. So if you look 5 years, 10 years into the future, what do you think the big tensions, the big areas of friction, the big contestations might be? They can be, they could be extrapolated from where we are now. They could be totally sci-fi, dystopias or utopias you're thinking of. So I wonder if you had to unleash your imagination, what the two of you might imagine. Nishant, you want to respond first?
Yeah, I mean, my gut reaction is like run as fast as possible, because no good is going to come out of this. And I say it slightly facetiously, but also a little bit with caution, because I think the challenges that these platforms are throwing up are not new. And that's the worry. The problems of what constitutes hate speech and the binary opposite with free speech, what constitutes public good as opposed to invasion of privacy, these are much larger and very entangled questions. The challenge that we have right now is to make sure, so let's make it very clear, there is never going to be a resolution, right? It's always going to be a continuous, as you say, a balancing act between the two. The problem right now is that there is a imagination that a global norm can be established around these things. That there is a specific geopolitical hegemony which is trying to say, oh, this is what free speech means, or this is what privacy means, and it doesn't. It doesn't mean the same thing in people's lived experiences, in the expectations and the needs of the communities, and in the ways in which people's relationship with governments and their local regulatory bodies are going to be. So it kind of comes back to the idea saying, if we do not localize our platforms, and this is not about just having a local instance on a local server, like the general data protection rights in Europe now does, saying, oh, if data is stored in Europe, then we have sorted out the data protection and privacy problem. No, we haven't. Because we haven't yet figured out what it means for a platform to be owned by the community, which then can decide the terms and negotiations which are specific to itself, and translate the untranslatable into these platforms. I think that's where the future friction is going to be the largest. And right now I said run as fast as you can is because increasingly the capacity to develop these new kinds of alternatives are being diminished by the Silicon Valley rhetoric, which imagines that the existing big platforms are too big to fail. But if the COVID pandemic has shown us anything, even the largest nations in the world are not too big to fail. And so how do you do a responsible dismantling where you build upon the expertise of these existing platforms, but force them to become not just for the public good, but become public good, right? So not platform for public good, but platforms as public good. I think that's going to be the biggest challenge.
That actually brings us very neatly to something, Bishakha, you and I have talked about earlier, which is how do you actually allow for accountability when it comes to more marginalized populations? How do you center them in this discourse? And how do you make platforms truly answerable, not just to the mainstream, but to those on the edges and the margins? How do you genuinely include them and give them a voice? And I know you have a lot to say about this, so let's hear it.
Okay, I think it's sort of a complicated concept, and maybe I'll start with an example. I think just like we talk of the digital gap, right, in access to, say, digital devices, which again, at this moment, as so many millions of people are struggling to get vaccines or vaccinated in India, we are seeing sort of what it means to not have digital access, right? Since we can only get vaccines through online appointments at this point. Similarly, I think one of the big problems is we have a huge gap currently in sort of understandings of platforms and data, right? So we have like millions and millions of people using platforms and really sort of having an understanding that, okay, when I talk about data, I'm talking about like recharging my mobile data, but not being able to connect that to the bigger questions of data collection, sort of the ways in which platforms work, etc., right? And sort of an understanding of what is the relationship between you and the platform, what is the transaction that is actually going on. That is not evident. So to be honest, and this will sound kind of utopian, is I think if we really want to talk about platform futures, seriously, we really have to think about how do we actually get users of platforms to understand the relationship more deeply and the transactions more deeply, so that the demands or can be made from a much broader base, right? Almost like a movement. And I want to think, I'm thinking actually about the net neutrality debates in India, for example. Net neutrality is a similarly abstract concept for most people. And yet I think the concept has come much closer to people's lives and has become much more relatable. And there's a sense of understanding why we want net neutrality, right? So I think one of the things that's important to me is really how do we sort of bridge that gap so that the ask in future is emanating from a much broader, diverse set of people, including people who sort of on a classic digital literacy scale would, be lower down at this moment. I think that's one. I think the other sort of complicated question, is really how do we even understand the relationship between bodies and data in future? a lot of the debate around data protection, data privacy, data valence, whatever we want to call it, these are all related, still treats data as something that is external to our bodies. And yet we have a, growing discourse, including Shoshana Zuboff, etc., many people talking about whether it's personhood, whether it's experiences, whether it's us, our selfhood, etc., that is being converted into data. So to me, if you ask me, like from a speculative and imaginative kind of sense of possibility, I think we would have a much stronger understanding of the relationships between platforms and us if we could really understand the relationship between our bodies and our data much more clearly, and perhaps I personally feel like data is an extension of our bodies, or perhaps is like a digital version of our bodies, or perhaps are sort of part of our bodies, right? And not resolved on the sort of which part of it, But I think those actually give us possibilities, but there's a way in which, even though conceptually these are very interesting possibilities, they're not going into sort of policy discussions, right? Where data is still being seen as an external resource.
And I think a lot of countries in Asia particularly are trying to tap into that sort of extractive frame where they're trying to assert national rights over their population's data, and they're treating the data of their people as a natural resource, right? Rather than saying it's something so private, so personal, so sensitive, they're saying, well, collectively, it's a massively important resource. And we should be addressing it as a collective object rather than something that's collectively owned by so many people or individually owned even. So yes, I think that's one of the big landscapes for future battlegrounds for sure. I think at this point, I'd love to bring in the authors of some of our papers who've done very targeted, very located studies into particular areas within their countries. And I'm going to turn over to Nishant, who will explain the sort of thinking when we partnered together on this, when we came up with this idea of small books for big platforms, which was sort of a working title that just stuck because it's playful, it's fun, but it also points to something in terms of a power dynamic. And I'll let Nishant explain that provocation more and bring in Kelly, Dave, and Smita, who will talk to us about the experiences described in their case studies of Korea, Taiwan, and India. So Nishant, I'll just stop here. Thank you.